Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on the future of enterprise social networking. There have been some changes in the landscape recently when it comes to enterprise social, so we want to put this webinar on to help you make some decisions, help you understand what that process might be like, and learn from some of the best in the industry to hear what their enterprise social journey looks like. So let's get started. Before we get started, just to give you a little introduction on who Unily is. We've been in the game since 2006 and we are an employee experience platform. Basically, we drive organizational velocity, helping the biggest, most iconic brands in the world move faster and help navigate the big ship when it comes to their industry. We've got over 5 million employees on the Unily platform using it day in, day out, and we are the only intranet employee experience provider that is listed as a triple leader. There are some big reports in the space at the moment, so for those of you that want to do that, please check that out. Our customers range from Estee Lauder companies, Shell, 7-Eleven, CVS Health, British Airways, some big names there. So you can see we're powering organizational velocity and the employee experience platform for some of the biggest, boldest, most iconic brands in the game. So, as I mentioned earlier, for those of you that do want to go away, maybe do a little bit of research on enterprise social, on your intranet, see what the rest of the market looks like. There are some really cool reports out there, whether you're a Gartner loyalist or a Forrester fan, or you want to look at IDC, get into some of the data. There are some big reports out there that help you research the marketscape, and they're all available from unily.com, so you can download them free of charge and see some of the other providers out there and how we perform as well. So let's get started. I have picked 3 lovely panelists to join me on this webinar, and I picked them for different perspectives and different understandings of enterprise social. I'm joined by Julian, who is Wipro's Global Director of AWS Partner Programs. You're also LGBTQ+ Chair at Wipro, and I know you have a lot of experience with the LGBTQ+ employee resource group at Wipro, and through that you've gained lots of experience using enterprise social, so I'm looking forward to tapping into that. Also joined by Amy. Hi Amy. Amy is our social and communities SME, so you do loads of great product marketing work, but when it comes to Unily's view on what enterprise social is, how it's going in the future, I wanted to make sure we had Amy on the panel to give us those perspectives and share some examples across our customer base as well. So looking forward to hearing those. And last but not least, Mark Chevis. We've worked together for a long time at Unily and our current VP of Solution Engineering. So for those of you that have some techie questions, whether it's about migration, what that journey looks like, then Mark is your guy. So I'll be posing some of those questions to Mark. So let's get started. It is a panel webinar, so I'll be asking questions in and out to our panelists, but just to give us a rough flow as we go through, we're going to start looking at some of the history, understanding the evolution of enterprise social networking, where we've come from. I know there are some historic technologies that started enterprise social networking. What were they and where are we going? Next, we put the theory into practice. How are organizations really using it today? And where do we see it going? Where are the opportunities? Then we'll go over to understand the path for migration. I know there are a lot of people watching this webinar that are current Meta workplace users that may be thinking about what is the path for migration. And so that section is really to get into the nuts and bolts of what that process looks like and what you should be thinking about when it comes to migration. Of course, we have reserved some time for audience Q&A as well. So for those of you that have questions, whether that's right now, you can submit them in the question and answer section of the webinar, and I will be going through at the end, posing your questions to our panelists. So let's start at the beginning, the evolution of social at work. Where did we come from? I really wanted to start with this section because when it comes to enterprise social, there is a history there. I know, Mark, for example, you've worked with different technologies over different periods of time. For me, it's really important to understand what the social backstory is here. I know in some bigger organizations, when it came to enterprise social networking, originally there was a bit of resistance here, but we still got to where we are today, one of the most highly adopted parts of the tech landscape. Mark, would you be able to use some of your experience and tell us a little bit about what the evolution of enterprise social has been, and what are some of the big markers you expect on that history timeline to help people build a picture of what enterprise social is?
Yeah, thank you, Kaz. I completely agree. We've definitely seen an evolution. If I cast my mind back, not quite as far back as this slide goes, but the very first platform that I was using from a tech perspective was Lotus Notes. That was the intranet. It was very much a traditional collation of content. It was actually managed then not by a communications function. That didn't exist in my first organization. It was done by librarians, because it was just that. It was content, and it was a content repository in the old sense. So what I think I've seen is two parallel tracks. You've got the technology landscape, and then you've got the user accessibility track as well. So if we look at that from the early stages, we saw this evolution of content repositories starting to then look at how we start to map the consumer grade in these early 2000s, where we started to see things like marketplaces popping up. So we would have a forum where people would post marketplace ideas of I'm selling a canoe, and people would start to engage. But that was more of a forum base. So it was more forum initiated than it was true enterprise social network. So we saw the technology in the consumer landscape evolving. There was then some slow uptake in the technology landscape, which then got accelerated around 2010 as we saw the likes of Yammer coming on board. So Yammer really leaped us forward when it came to true enterprise social networks. And at the time, Yammer was independent of SharePoint and the traditional Microsoft stack. So what we had was traditional forum-based conversations now moving into that enterprise social component with Yammer. And that was when we started to see this uptick in talking out loud, the ability to truly crowdsource and crowd share ideas. And that is where we started to see some of those enterprise social network components coming in. Now, there's a lot of things in there because you've got the traditional competing with the modern. So you've got traditional governance structures published by my good friends, the librarians, back in the early 2000s, now competing with the social. So what we then had was this secondary track where we then had user behavior. And what's interesting is many organizations today are still struggling with some of that. We have the technology in place, but some of the inherent cultures within organizations, many of which are traditional, hierarchical, are looking for ways in which to share, to discuss, to better collaborate, to drive that productivity. And what they're having to do is introduce this concept of allowing their users to partake. So from a very traditional knowledge management, moving us forward into enterprise social network for all, leveraging that consumer grade, but reinforcing that consumer journey and that user journey is really important. And with that is the things that we need to make sure we understand today. How do we ensure and guarantee accuracy of content? How do we prevent just being noise from everyone talking out loud? And make sure that whatever we do is integrated throughout our entire ecosystem. So as I mentioned earlier, if we look at that middle point, those systems were all independent. They weren't connected. There was no correlation between them. So if we look to today, it's how do we harness that power to make sure that everyone has a voice, we can guarantee content accuracy, and it can be fully integrated throughout our ecosystem. So definitely somewhere where we started in the early days, and it's been an interesting few decades watching this evolve, and as we see where we are at the moment. So yeah, thank you, Kaz.
Interesting, those two tracks there. Also, what I really took away from that is the different use cases that you were able to pick up, whether it's the kind of working out loud or whether it's some of like the crowdsourcing of things. I remember one of my earliest workplace memories was actually starting in the workplace and seeing how they're just like, I'm a millennial. I kind of grew up with some of these social platforms, the Facebooks of the world, the MySpace as well, justice for MySpace, and seeing how like communication was so different, parallel from what it was, what I was used to growing up to coming into the workplace. And then as you see, enterprise social grew from that. Cool, that was a really good history timeline of enterprise social and where it leaves us today. So I'm also keen to know, Julian, from you. So Mark's painted a really good picture of the overall evolution of social. But when it comes to Wipro as an organization, what was your experience of that history? And also from a personal perspective, what was your experience in that history? And where is Wipro today when it comes to enterprise social?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kaz. So maybe before I jump into the Wipro context where we migrated from Yammer or Viva Engage to Unily Social, I want to reflect on my earlier career when I was working in a startup in Silicon Valley. Back in the day, we were using Facebook, and I'm not talking about Facebook Workplace, I'm talking about the regular Facebook, and we had created private groups where we invited our colleagues based on different projects that were going on. We also had one specifically for company announcements, and we used that social media tool, which was not meant to be used in a professional context. We made it a professional tool because we needed to have that instant communication, which email didn't provide, and we really wanted to make sure that everybody could contribute and that everybody had a voice. I think that's what you mentioned, Mark, right, as one of the aspects. And we were in a scenario where we had distributed teams, and this was pre-pandemic, but that was already something very, very noticeable at the time. And so that was really for me the first foray into professional social media, using a tool that wasn't necessarily meant to be used that way. Fast forward a few years when I joined Wipro, at the time Yammer was rolled out. It then became Viva Engage. And then more recently, last year, to be more specific, we migrated to Unily Social as part of the wider migration to Unily, which allowed us to have a centralized intranet. And so what we experienced really has been something that's really more social, that's integrated with our intranet as well. That was an important thing because prior to that, everything was quite disconnected from an employee experience perspective. But it's really that ability to merge what you would experience using social media tools. So the responsiveness, the really neat user interface, merging that into the work experience is really transformational for an enterprise organization like Wipro, because anything you do to move away from email is really helpful.
Cool. I like the fact that people are seeing the as a personal fan that wants to move away from email. Of course, it has its place, but great to see that Wipro are seeing the opportunity of enterprise social to complement some of those other technologies. Also, what I love about your early experience with using Facebook there is it goes to show leaders that enterprise social isn't technology for the sake of technology, that actually this was something grassroots, it was ground up. People found an opportunity to get value from using some of these social tools. And that enterprise social was a direct answer to looking at some of those social tools and the opportunities and applying them to the organization. Love that. Thank you. So, Amy, I'm going to come to you next. I'm going to ask you to put your Unily hat on. And so if we zoom out on some of these changes, we've heard from Wipro how they experienced that history and now how they've migrated from Viva Engage to Unily. We've heard of some of the big picture social media changes and the jives of the world and where that leaves us today. But if you're watching this as an enterprise organization and a leader in IT or communications, where does that leave you today? And what do we as Unily think is the optimal experience when it comes to enterprise social and an enterprise social strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have a really nice slide, hopefully to complement my answer.
Looking forward to this.
But what you've heard from Mark and Julian is a lot about siloed experiences. And I think especially in large complex organizations, they're already struggling with silos. So having a technology stack that also operates in silos is just going to have a negative impact on how they can report, how they can innovate, how they can be productive. So I think the first thing when enterprises are thinking about an optimal enterprise grade social strategy, it's recognizing two issues where they can often fall flat. So we see those as being lack of governance and poor integration. So if we tackle those two things and we build and we weave a social experience into our employee experience platform and our intranet, then we're really addressing those problems head on. And I think it's recognizing the value that you're trying to get out of it. So it's not just about giving people a voice, although that's absolutely a great part of social, but there are productivity gains to be captured from insights that you're seeing within communities, from innovation portals, from knowledge hubs. But if that's a siloed experience, how is that being fed throughout the fabric of your workplace and of your tools? And then another thing that I want to highlight, and this wasn't necessarily such a big thing for Wipro, but we do know that with a lot of businesses that we speak to, they have a predominantly they have a big frontline workforce. And so part of that strategy needs to be thinking about the mobile experience and adoption for frontline workers. And there was a stat, I love stats. So there was a stat that came out from Gartner saying that 86% of hourly employees say it's important for their organization to see them as a person and not just an employee. And so I think that speaks to the strategy around capturing the engagement of that workforce, which is often some of our most disengaged members, and doing that with tools that are integrated, that are consumer grade, as Mark spoke to. And then finally, as part of that really robust enterprise grade strategy, it's underpinning everything in your technology stack with security and governance. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the features that make that possible. But I think partnering with someone who has that proven experience with complex organizations that you can really trust, so that you don't end up with unwieldy social channels that are just doing their own thing. I think those things are really important to a strategy.
Yes, I think what I really like about this visual in particular is that it goes to show that when it comes to any communication technology, whether it's enterprise social or whether it's your intranet or anything like that, I think it's important to think about, like, you have to make conscious decisions about how all of this fits together. I know you brought this quote, Amy, which I quite like, from Gartner, which is that the actions you take today will shape your organization's future of work. And so even choosing not to act will shape your organization's future of work, which talks to exactly what we just said, which is not thinking about technologies as reactive bolt-ons based on needs, but actually taking responsibility, zooming out, understand how does all of this fit together? How does it integrate? How does one tool talk to another? How do we, in reality, expect employees to use these technologies together day to day? So I love the visual you came up with for that slide. So really, really appreciate that.
Me too.
So I have a couple more questions. So one for you, Mark. So we've spoken about some of those kind of trials and tribulations of enterprise social, maybe how some people might have making some mistakes, maybe have the wrong strategy. How do we make sure that, how can someone watching this make sure that they don't make the same mistakes of the past and they don't repeat the same mistakes that they might have made before?
Yeah, really good question, Kaz. And I think actually there's a word that Amy, it's almost as if we planned this. But I promise you we didn't. There's a word that Amy said there, which I want to pick up on when we start this, and that's trust. Because the very first thing when we're thinking about avoiding mistakes of the past, when I say the past, it's probably very recent past, is for the trust, we need to have accuracy. Go back to that very first thing I said. I inherited a platform on Lotus Notes run by librarians. It was so heavily curated within an inch of his life, you could almost guarantee accuracy. As we've kind of moved to the other end of the spectrum and created the fully social component, we've unleashed some of that. And that's caused this bit of challenges in ensuring accuracy. So the first thing for me is when I'm looking at avoiding the mistakes of the past and the more recent past, especially when it comes to those challenges, how do we preserve accuracy without derailing the speed that social brings us? And with that, I think there's looking at how our systems putting auto governance in place, how can we scale that, making sure that we have the right functional structures of our platforms. So I'll talk about that in just a moment. But like Amy, I love a stat as well, and just so happens to also be from Gartner, but content accuracy, Gartner is quoting roughly $12.6 million a year in lost revenue due to inaccurate content throughout the productivity lifecycle. Because if you find something that's out of date, you're then spending time looking for something that's right. So that content accuracy is causing issues. So the first thing to avoid the mistakes of the past is how do we find and strike that balance? And with that also comes with thinking about how we're structuring the content. So you'll have seen around 2010, and if we go back to that earlier slide, there was that pivot point almost where we went from the traditional IA to more modern, which was when we started seeing social coming in as primary. We had the introduction of flat IA. Everything was very flat. There was no structure to it. That also did two things. One, it made traditional IA management harder, but it also made discoverability harder. So the flat structures were resulting in often sites being spun up with one piece of content in it, so it was never being truly properly indexed. So when you were looking at things such as search, it wasn't getting the right content in the right place. In addition, users were looking for content through the more traditional navigational structures and so forth. And again, they were just struggling to find it. So the first thing for me is content accuracy. How do we preserve that? The second thing is thinking, is a flat structure truly enterprise grade when we need to preserve discoverability? And then my final one in this section is thinking about how you're then empowering and creating the system generated elements to enhance that discoverability. So this is things like metadata. Are we using things like folksonomy based metadata models? Are we using managed metadata models? Here at Unily, and I know Kaz, you and I have discussed over the years, I've been lucky enough to work with many of our clients migrating off of Jive. So we have a dedicated Jive methodology. And one of the very first customers I was working with, 6 years ago, kind of almost blew my mind. They had over 15 different ways to tag content with New York City. So folksonomy can introduce speed, but it can also degrade content discoverability, accuracy. So it can often play against us when we start scaling that content out. So it's how do we find that managed model? So folksonomy versus managed metadata, what's the right balance? What do you use when? Hashtags is a folksonomy based process, has their place. Managed metadata for content, for governed content, also really important. So how do the two sit side by side? So I think for me, to avoid some of those mistakes that we've made over the last few years, is thinking about those three things. How can we preserve and guarantee content accuracy? How can we think about the structuring of that IA? And finally, how do we preserve discoverability with the right metadata models?
Nice, you've very nicely bridged our first section into our second section there. So we've looked at the evolution there. Now look at actually materially what are the things we can put into practice now to avoid making those mistakes of the past. Julian, I want to come to you next, because I know you referenced earlier that when you were Aviva engaged, you had a bit of an unwieldy estate there when it came to enterprise social. And Mark's kind of discussed some of the markers there to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes of the past. Of course, you as Wipro want to ensure that your social strategy is up to scratch and making sure that what you have today stays of high quality as it is. What are some of the things that you're doing to ensure that you don't make the same mistakes of the past and it doesn't become as unwieldy, you can maintain the quality that you've got today?
Yeah, thanks, Kaz. So indeed, before we migrated to Unily, we had about 700 communities. There was no governance in place. It was all chaotic. Lots of communities were dormant. So out of that 700 number, right, not all of them were flourishing or even maintained properly. So as part of the migration discovery and the migration itself, a lot of these communities either ended up getting merged or not migrated and were deprecated. And now, a year after we migrated, we have close to 80 communities, so about a tenth of the prior number. And these communities are really managed with a governance model that's been defined, and it's not there to make things more difficult. It's just bring a bit of rigor to the way we manage our communities. So nowadays we have about 30,000 people who regularly use social.
Wow, 30,000 people. That's cool.
Yeah. That includes 200 community managers who are all volunteers, but that's a role that didn't really exist officially before, and that's it's a volunteer role, but it's something that has been codified. And as part of that governance model, there's a training and onboarding process for new community managers and aspiring community managers who go through the basics of social and how they can maintain their communities, and how they can also on a regular basis find out more about successful communities, successful strategies to build engagement and create engagement in other communities. And so we have these monthly connects where all the community managers are invited, and there's a spotlight on various activities that are happening. And all of that stems from a centralized governance, where if you want a new community, you have to go through a process where you submit a short business case, you explain what's the purpose of the community. There's going to be an executive sponsor who also sits behind, and there's identified community managers, at least 2 or 3. And just that seems very simple, but just having that in place has tremendously improved the quality of the communities without stifling the grassroots aspect where anybody can contribute content. Obviously, the community managers are there to make sure that the communities are maintained and they're dropping engaging content on a regular basis. And we've also, outside of that, there's a community of experts who help really drive things forward. What you're showing on the screen at the moment is also a badging system where people who have been community managers for a while and achieve a certain level of engagement with their users can get a badge. And then we'll also have an actively building social communities, which is in the next level badge for super community managers who have a strong impact and are helping coach others along the way as well. So all of that has really helped level up how we're using enterprise social community in an organization where we have over 230,000 employees, with people scattered around the world working on client projects. So that really helps build the engagement over time.
Nice. What I'm taking away from what you said there is that don't underestimate the role of a good community manager. And it seems like you put in some good work here. I can tell from the visual that like this is like proper community management, the right access to information. I guess you can ask questions as well, understanding who you can talk to. This is like good, rigorous community management. I love that. It's not a free for all. So this is very cool. So that's putting the theory into practice within Wipro. Throughout the webinar so far, we've had a lot of talk about strategy, the right strategy, how things work together. I want to get into some of the nuts and bolts, Amy. So when it comes to enterprise social and some of the capabilities, features, use cases, there's been a lot of talk of stuff throughout the webinar so far, but I want to know what you think when it comes to enterprise social. What are some of the bells and whistles when it comes to enterprise grade social?
Yeah. And I guess for our product teams, it was understanding the pain points and then delivering products that help to solve them, right? And there's on the screen, there's quite a few of our critical capabilities. But to make it a bit more manageable, I wanted to break it down into 3, if that's okay. So the first, I think, is adoption. So that's almost what your team see, what is going to get them engaged, what's going to attract them to actually use and interact with the capabilities. And so that's mimicking consumer grade experiences, emojis, GIFs, though I do want to put a caveat, they're governed GIFs, they're not just again, a free-for-all.
Gifts, I love that. Because everyone loves a gift, but yeah, within reason.
And then rich posting experiences, so being able to post photos, videos straight from your phone directly into channels. And then I think around this, unleashing knowledge and sharing value. So again, we want to drive value. So we know that effective knowledge sharing is critical. So tools that we help support are things like blogging, innovation portals, which are an out-of-the-box capability at Unily, front-end publishing, polls, surveys, forms to help capture insights, and then of course analytics to be able to report on those. And then another thing that's on here is AI translation. So with a lot of the businesses that we work with, they're global. So how does somebody in the UK interact with someone in India who interacts with someone in the US, and maybe where there's those language barriers, like what are those translation capabilities that make that really accessible? And then finally, and this is the unsexy stuff, which you would have heard Julian speaking about as well, is governance. And we do come back to this quite a lot, but enterprise grade security, permissions, auto governance as well. So if, as Julian said, he's got 200 volunteers as community managers, that's a lot to ask for them to be constantly flagging and checking those community sites. So what are the prohibited words? What are those chains of escalation, so that you're not just building experiences that your teammates want to engage with, but they're safe to engage with, and you know that they're having a direct value on your business.
Well, who says governance isn't sexy, right, Mark? Especially when it comes to like loads of communities and large employee populations being able to contribute. But I'm like a GIF and a meme person, so I love those photos and visuals. But from an adoption perspective, what's quite interesting is that I heard someone say recently, like the single biggest thing you can do to support your content and communication adoption is ensure that people can access it in the language that they speak, especially when it comes to large organizations across the globe. People are creating communications in their local or native language, but if you really want to up the adoption on that, you've got to make sure that translation is part of that strategy, so social or otherwise.
Yeah, and even learning styles, so how people want to interact, it being able to support video and audio and text. I think they're really key considerations, and that accessibility piece is really important.
I can't remember the exact stat, but I saw a stat literally yesterday talking about the amount of content being created externally, which is video, consumption wise, like 86% of the content you consume is like video. I think it's in the 80s, which goes to show, if we look back at a history slide from before, you can predict what's coming in the workplace from some of the things that are happening in consumer grade technology. So video is not to be underestimated. So that brings me to next section here, and this is my favorite one, because as we were planning this webinar, I asked each of our panelists to go away and have a think about an example or a use case they thought really put enterprise social into practice and showed the value to the business. So I know you've each got one example. We'll start with Julian at Wipro, and tell us a little bit about your example and how enterprise social adds value to your business. I know you're a big community fan, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Kaz. I'm glad you're asking about this. So in the Wipro context, the example I wanted to bring forward is the example of our Pride at Wipro group. So it actually all started from Yammer, where we had a community which was one of the pilot communities that got migrated to Unily. And that was a bit of a rebirth for it. And initially we used it as a centralized point to gather key content and key information for people. So besides the social engagement and broadcasting abilities, we also had Q&As and some of the internal documents, the policy, the anti-discrimination policy, for example, which was all packaged into that social media page. And as the dot was also rolled out, that also helped us establish a more permanent footprint as well. under our diversity, equity, and inclusion section on the intranet, which is now which people can navigate very intuitively. We have a private Wipro page, which has allowed us to really expand on how much content we are sharing, and all of the blogs that are happening throughout the year, the events, the initiatives, and coming back full circle, we've also recently embedded the community onto that page. So there's not only the ability to view that community when you're under the social tab, but also on that landing page itself. So that's a really powerful integration aspect, which has also helped us increase engagement and visibility, right? And what do we share in our community? Well, it's all about sharing information about events that are taking place, communicating upcoming events, sharing video content that we record internally through our ERG meetings that are taking place either globally or more locally. So that's really the key use case from a Pride ERG perspective. I also wanted to bring up this anecdote from about over a year ago when we were looking to put together our first Transgender Awareness Week. We were looking for people to contribute and participate. And through a social outreach, someone responded who was based in the US and say, well, I'm happy to talk about my experience as a trans person. And that's really how we started the whole topic and conversation within Wipro. So that's also showing the power of reaching out to anybody in the world and really giving a voice to people who may not otherwise be heard, and identifying colleagues who may not have otherwise come across through regular channels. So really that power of community you can see in the social, and how this has an impact on at the enterprise level.
Yeah, I think it's really what's really adding value here as well is with an organization as large as Wipro and an increasingly hybrid remote working styles that we have, if you really want to have global valuable employee resource groups, make sure that they're siloless, then you need something like this that enables people to contribute their stories no matter where they are, have access to resources no matter where they are. It shows that you've really put the thinking beyond just the community itself, but the resources, the events, the whole shebang around that employee resource group. So I really like that. Really appreciate that. Great story. Thank you, Julian. So who have we got next? We have Mark. I think you brought this Holland and Barrett example, didn't you? I know Amy spoke a little bit about ideation earlier. So maybe explain a bit more about that and how Holland and Barrett use it.
Yeah, I think what I really like about Holland and Barrett as an example is it's not just about the internal. And Holland and Barrett have a very good way of explaining that. So we've talked a lot about enterprise social networks empowering the internal experience, ensuring that when we think about productivity at work, when we think about, the creating communities at work, it's first and foremost there and supporting it. Holland and Barrett actually flipped it, and they're using ideation to look at efficiencies within their retail environment. So those who don't know, Holland and Barrett are a large EMEA-based retail organization. So they have majority of being retail employees. And what they were able to do is use ideation through mobile-first technology to really think about the customer experience. So think about how can they start to gather insights into their retail experience to improve not only their employee productivity, but ultimately their bottom line. And that ability to listen, so that employee listening and capabilities, the ability to then pivot quickly and make faster pivots within their organization, ultimately allows them to be more agile as a company. So the use of enterprise social networks combined with tools such as ideation, and then making sure it's mobile first for their organization to collaborate, is ultimately driving their bottom line. And that for me is why I think it's such a compelling story of understanding we think about productivity gains, we think about connectivity and creating community, but also all of those things, and looking at through the lens of Holland and Barrett, ultimately the employee experience drives the customer experience. And that is why I think it's such a compelling story.
I think this story is great because as we talk about organizations winning in the next era, increasingly, and we see this internally at Unily, is how you mobilize the ideas across your organization. And those ideas can't exist in isolation. They grow by socializing them. And so what's great about Holland & Barrett is that people can contribute those ideas, but the ideas become bigger and better through being socialized, enterprise social, adding different perspectives, growing those ideas into something bigger and better. So really great example. Thank you for bringing that. And I know we have another example from Amy, and you brought Kersner. So tell us a little bit about that.
I do, though. I almost feel like this should be yours because you went out to...
I'm a Kersner fanboy, fangirl.
If anyone's seen the video, Kaz went out and shot one at the Palm in Dubai, and it is gorgeous. So I highly recommend. But Kersner are luxury hotel brands. And as anyone who works in the luxury industry knows, customer service is everything, right? And if you've engaged with Unily content before, you'll know that we speak a lot about EX equals CX, that employee experience equaling customer experience squared. I think you added the square, Kaz. But where I wanted to hone in on with the Kersner story was around access to knowledge. So thinking about where Kersner was prior to engaging with Unily, the way they were accessing knowledge, particularly in their call center, was with spreadsheets. So Excel spreadsheets that were really outdated. They could crash. People working in the hotels didn't have direct access to that knowledge. So they were then having to call the call centers. You would then have to look through the spreadsheet. And that experience for customers was slow, probably quite painful. And so one area that they just addressed so well was access to knowledge and democratizing access to knowledge. So in the screenshots that I've provided, these are knowledge portals and then of course search. And what was cool about the knowledge portals were they were answers to frequently answered questions, but they were kept fresh with social capabilities. So liking, disliking, asking more questions. So really making sure that that single source of truth is accurate and up to date. And there's I'm sorry, we have more stats. I'm sorry. But the cool stats that I wanted to call out are in the first 12 months, iConnect, which is what their intranet was called or is called, recorded 59,000 searches. Their mobile first approach to a 70% frontline workforce who didn't have email access had a 99% adoption rate at the Atlantis Palm. So I think there was a real appetite for this platform and this service. And the great thing that we hear anecdotally from Kersner is that it had a direct correlation on the experience that they provided for their customers. There was none of this slowness or inaccurate information. And everyone, not just the call center, but the security guards, the front desk, the cleaners, all had access to the knowledge portals straight from their phone. So that experience really shifted and really elevates that story that they're telling.
What's great about this example is that, like, we always typically talk about the gap between the frontline experience and the desk worker experience, and both the Kersner example and the Holland & Barrett example really show the bridging of that gap and, as you say, democratizing access to that knowledge so that people actually delivering the first-hand customer experience can do it without having to leverage desktop workers and call people up. So that's really cool. Actually, I want to stick with that before we move on. So the last two examples we've seen have been heavy frontline workforces. One of the things I'm keen to know about is, we've spoken about enterprise social and communities. An element of the more social working is, of course, like direct messaging. Where does Unily see direct messaging in the bigger picture, in the broader social landscape?
Yeah, and we're really excited because this is currently in development. I'm in the team that's helping develop it, so I've done the demos and seeing it in play, and it's really great. It really mimics tools that we're used to, so that adoption will be there. But the strategy behind it is we know, having spoken to people like Kersner and many of our other customers, that their frontline staff are using other tools. They're using unshadowed IT tools. They're using WhatsApp, Facebook, whatever they can get their hands on to chat to each other. And if we want to think about secure, scalable solutions, connecting head office with frontline, direct messaging was a really key capability that we needed to bring to market. And we see that being a game changer, not only for connecting and bridging that gap, as you say, but again, with that collaboration, access to knowledge, quick crisis communication, whatever it is. But as with all things Unily, having it in a really secure, scalable, robust tool that integrates with the whole technology stack.
I see how it like closes the loop on some of the bigger enterprise social stuff. When you're seeing valuable conversations in different communities you're a part of, I can imagine people wanting to bridge those out into direct conversations and things like that. So I see how it is part of the bigger picture. I love that. Thank you for talking about that. So let's move on to our migration section. The original idea for this webinar was looking at some of the changes that happening in the enterprise social landscape, triggered by, of course, the news that Workplace by Meta will be sunsetting. And we do have our resident migration expert on. I know I know you've kind of hinted at some of the things that might be coming. So Mark, I want to know from you. You've worked on migration projects of different shapes and sizes from different tools. For those that are starting to embark on that migration journey, what can they expect in that process, and how can they really set themselves up for success as part of a migration?
Yeah, thank you, Kaz. And you're right. We have discussed a fair bit of this as we've kind of gone through this session. So the first one for me is data hygiene. So when we're thinking about preparing for migration, that's where we have to start. And that should happen way before we actually think about where we're going. So when we're talking about data hygiene, Julian, you mentioned it, you had over 700 groups, you're now down to 80. Data hygiene isn't just about the pure content. It's about the platform. It's about how it's structured. So the first thing to start with is spend some time thinking about how you and your organization are going to qualify what data hygiene means to you. Different organizations in different fields will have different legal requirements from a data retention perspective. So you may want to migrate only the last 18 months in industry A, but in the banking industry, legal retention requires a longer duration. So understanding what data hygiene means to you, to your organization, is the place to start. Falling out of that is that IA mapping. So a lot of tools which are social first often have a flat structure. So there is no hierarchical structures to it. We've seen this from tools such as Jive, where we look at auto migrations, and the communications team will usually have between 10 and 50 subspaces, so subsites, all of which are flat. They have no correlation to them. So when we start thinking about how that comes back together to not only, I used the word earlier, drive discoverability, we need to think how we rebuild that into a more scalable, discoverable IA that makes the user experience better. So number one, data hygiene. And number two is about structures, which includes everything from hierarchical structures to permission-based structures to find that balance. The final one.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, it's okay. As the final one, just quickly, actually, we haven't discussed, but to put it on the table, is about change management. Start the conversation early. Because if we don't start the conversation early, what will happen is people won't be part of the journey, and then they feel that the change is being imposed on them rather than them being part of the change. Okay, so those are my three.
The irony of me almost cutting you out before change management, arguably the most important one. Okay, cool. So plenty to get us started there. Julian, of course, you went through that experience at Wipro. You migrated from Viewer Engage to Unily. What does that resonate with your experience? How was the migration experience for you?
Yeah, so I mostly experienced the migration as an end user or business user, but I know that the actual migration was required a dedicated core team that we had put in place. So there was representation from major functions in the company, including our IT services, the comms team, business teams. There was a user research team as well that did a lot of the pre-work to understand the needs of the users and to really help create something that would make sense for the organization. Also a dedicated development team, designers, branding. So it was a really well integrated group of colleagues who made it happen. Now, migration to social was part of the wider rollout of the Unily platform, which at Wipro is known as the DOT. That's the branded iteration that we have in the organization. So that came with its own set of branding, brand image, look and feel. It's integrated with the rest of our platform, so we can look up users from the directory. We can have profiles, etc. So it's that integration piece was really a key aspect. And before, where we had lots of different applications scattered across different social communities as well, now we have one gateway landing spot. So when you're a new joiner now, you have a really great employee experience compared to if I reflect on when I joined, because today it's a lot easier to access information, get information that is curated, and that will help you really get situated in this massive organization that is Wipro. And what this enables as well is that you get personalized topics, checklists, and tasks list are on our landing page, and that's personalized to your particular profile. We've now integrated a bot. The social aspect that we discussed earlier is also there. And so from multiple platforms to that single platform, that's really, I think, one of the biggest aspects, that gateway that helps you as an employee start your day and access these tools at your fingertips. The search feature is also something that's super valuable because it provides access to all kinds of information, and that's also curated in different sections, whether you're looking for a person or a particular topic or community. All of that is also segmented, so it's very intuitive, and it's really bringing the next level of employee experience, which I think a lot of the time people suffer from or experience. The challenges that people experience is that you've got this great consumer grade experience in your day-to-day life, and when you go to work, sometimes it feels like you're walking back in time and you're using these systems that are not up to par. With Unily and the DOT, that's really changed the game for all of us, and in a wider sense as well, reduced the number of emails and brought a lot of productivity improvements for everybody. So those are the key aspects that I wanted to highlight.
What's quite compelling about all your answers, Julian, it seems that in every part of the project or program, this wasn't like a lift and shift for you, whether that's the communities, understanding what communities we migrate, how we migrate them, how we maintain the quality, but also from an overall migration perspective, it seems like a real opportunity. You went back to the drawing board, understand this isn't a like-for-like social tool, it's seeing the opportunity to work out how everything works together and how one tool can add value to the other. So definitely some interesting learnings there. I know we've probably pinged loads of ideas in people's minds talking about migration. So for those of you that are in that process, are embarking on that journey to migrate from Workplace by Meta or any other social tool, I think we are offering a free 1-hour consultation. You'll get someone from Unily who will come in, understand your landscape, help you understand some of those learnings of the migration journey and what it might look like. So if you are interested in that and you want to embark on that journey, then just scan that QR code and we fill in the form and we'll be in touch to set something up. Excellent. So we are coming up perfectly on time, and to come to our question and answer, and I already see that some people have been putting in questions that we can answer from the community. People have been asking questions, voting on them, and I'm going to go based on the top voted question. Anyone feel free to answer these, but I will direct them at who I think will be best placed for them. So starting with the top question, which is, How are people who use enterprise social encouraging employees to post or engage with other content? We've done campaigns to educate people on the enterprise social channel, but engagement is limited. So it's really encouraging better adoption engagement with enterprise social. Amy, I'm going to come to you on this one.
Yeah, I saw this in the chat. So I've been thinking a little bit about it, and I think if your leadership team is bought in and they're engaging, they're available in channels as well, as a really big thing. So not just that they're liking posts and commenting, that is great, but actually you can have a dialogue with them, which isn't always available to you when you work in such big companies. I think that's a really cool hook. And I've heard of the 3-2-1, which you can get. You're nodding.
I know this. Yeah, I've used this before. Yeah, it's a good way. Sometimes there is a bit of resistance with leaders to go to an assistant or to go to another colleague, being like, "Can you craft this for me?" Or they'll go on once in a while and blast, but actually, it's like encouraging the habit. It's kind of like the 3-2-1. It's like, I can't remember exactly, but it's like 3 posts.
Yeah. 3 posts,
3 likes,
2 comments, 1 share.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
3 posts, 2 comments, 1 share. And it just holds you accountable as well. So if you do have a leadership team, some will naturally want to do this more than others, but if you can encourage that across the business, that can be really good. And then 2 that have already come up, which Julian, you spoke to, but you mentioned the badges. That was one that I thought was really cool. So who are your top contributors? Allocate them badges. I love a badge, like a leaderboard, anything like that is great. And I think it acknowledges the people that are doing really well and encourages people that buy into that to join in. And then user-generated content campaigns. So the reason I highlight that is we spoke to National Grid. This was in our masterclass, wasn't it, Kaz? They did some user-generated campaigns which were based on values in the business. Then they would create an award system and then blogs on the winners of those awards that represented those values. So say it was like authenticity, for example. But then where I think it's really cool, especially if you're struggling with engagement from, say, the front line, is they then put those campaigns on digital signage, and then there were QR codes. So people would see familiar faces because it was localized. They would want to read more about their friend Sally or their manager Steve, and they would scan that QR code, which would take them to that content on the app. And I think things like that, it's trying to map out where your team are, what are their touch points, how can I encourage collaboration and engagement. And then I think it's leading with values, that first piece, which is really driven by leadership.
Yeah, I think when it comes to adoption, sometimes people think, how much more can we do to increase adoption? But actually, it's about ensuring that, as you say, people are sharing their stories, that there's the content there. I know there's the story that you mentioned earlier, Julian, about Trans Pride, such a Trans Pride in London this weekend. But yeah, like understanding those stories that like bring people together. It's not necessarily about the top down. Of course, the leadership engagement is important, but understanding both sides, the top down and the bottom up as well. So some good tips there. Thank you. So the next question I have is, for those who have transitioned to a new platform like Unily or Viva, how long did it take to gain significant buy-in and engagement from employees? I think, Julian, you're probably best placed for this one.
Thank you. I was hoping you were going to ask me this question indeed. So we made a corporate decision to move away from Yammer and use Unily Social as part of the wider migration, and that took about a year, right, to have it up and running. That was part of our overall journey to migrate. And as I mentioned earlier, the social part itself, where we had 700 communities, all of that governance model had to be defined, put in place with some pilot communities, etc. We decided to decommission Yammer as well very quickly, rapidly after migrating to Unily without importing all of the content from some of the communities. And that was really meant to help with the buy-in for the new social, right? When it came to specific activities that helped drive that transition and that migration and that adoption, we focused on executive engagement. There were key communities that were used as pilot communities, and that really helped as well drive that level of engagement with our end users. Also having identified very dynamic community managers and developed that new role that I was talking a little bit about earlier. And now the other thing that we think is going to help drive adoption as well is that we're evolving the mobile app to help increase accessibility, because not everybody's got access to a Wipro laptop. A lot of colleagues are working on client accounts, and therefore they don't necessarily have that ability to log into our systems easily. So that is another lever that should help us with the adoption.
That's that don't underestimate that technical enablement piece. It's not turn it on and they will come. It's understanding, can people access it? Do they have the right devices? Is it from an accessibility perspective? Is it accessible? So yeah, some good tips there to get people going. Coming on to my next question. What would you say is the biggest benefit of Unily from an employee experience perspective, based on current user tried and tested experiences? Also a Unily specific question. Mark, you've got your Unily years behind you. Let's come to you on this one.
Thanks. You probably, as you're saying it, the cogs were turning to think what I'd put there. But no, I think
I'm sure you could go on for ages on this one, couldn't we?
Well, exactly. Keep me short, right?
Yeah.
I think when we think about the biggest benefits, the first thing, we mentioned this earlier, has to be around discoverability. Is when we think about enterprise organizations, so truly large organizations, and organizations who are looking to drive that usability, it's how do we find that balance? Most organizations, probably most people on this webinar with us today, will have multiple systems that they use on a day-to-day basis. One of Unily's core strengths is how do we bring those together to reduce the amount of digital friction that the user are facing on a day-to-day basis. So that, I think, is a really important part when it comes to Unily. So it's having a highly configurable platform which can reduce digital friction, where we're jumping between those applications that we need to do our job, whilst ensuring we can deliver the communications and the components that we need to make the user experience at work important. So those kind of, from a user perspective, the things that I would want to really focus on. Now, very quickly, there are probably two of the unsexy things that I think are really important. It's kind of what I love talking about. One is we talked a lot about governance and governance throughout. It goes back to content accuracy. Amy talked about it earlier when we talked about GIFs. Something as simple as a GIF, inherently in Unily, every component is governed. AI is a great example of that. Many systems are, going to go quick to market with plug and play AI capabilities. That doesn't mean it's accurate. Doesn't mean it's relevant. Actually, that can introduce more noise. So one of the things here at Unily, whether it's governed GIFs, governed AI, or governed management, or governed reporting, we have to have an enterprise-grade governance structure which goes throughout the platform. And the final part of that has to be around architecture, security, and support. So 3 really important from a usability perspective, and a couple of the unsexy ones which make the usability so successful.
Nice, very well answered. Thank you. And so the next question we've got here is, what steps have you taken to find that balance between providing regular, relevant content to inform, but not overwhelming employees with too much content? I'm actually happy to take this one because I've been in a lot of conversations recently around, comms noise and social noise, and finding that balance, because of course you want it to be thriving, you want access to loads of stuff there, but equally you don't want it to be ping, ping, ping overwhelming. There are a few things. One, actually, I'll pick up from Mark, which was around enterprise governance. The reality is, in larger complex organizations, there will be a lot of content communications out there, but with the right governance features, that stuff can be automated. You can put rules in place that take control of some of that, make sure there are regular review cycles, make sure things don't become too unwieldy, have the analytics to understand what that governance looks like, those sorts of things. So I think governance plays a big role to ensure that it's not adding extra work to IT teams or communications teams to have to control that, but have some automated rules that govern the experience for you so that it just doesn't become too unwieldy in the first place. The other side of that, I would say, is don't underestimate the importance of personalization. There'll always be a lot of comms and content out there, but people have their personal preferences. We've spoken about email, mobile, all these different types of ways that people can be notified of what's going on. I would say people have their preferences. Let them control when, where they get some of those notifications. I know I'm not an email person, and so I like to restrict the number of notifications and noise I get from email, really restricting it to the most critical notifications that I need. But I'm the person that sort of organizes a lot of my life around my push app mobile notifications. So I put a lot of those on. I want to know what's happening, and then I get to a certain point in the day, usually at the end or when I've had a bit of a lull post lunch, and I'll like sort some of those notifications, catch up with loads of stuff there. And so it helps. That's like personal to me, and I'm sure people have their own preferences, but don't underestimate the importance of the kind of how people pull their preferences towards them, because you won't be able to define one social communication strategy for everybody. It's let people have a bit of control of that. And my final kind of wildcard suggestion, which was sparked by someone mentioned AI just then, is maybe have a look to how some of the newer technologies can really provide the intelligence to help people fine-tune some of that noise. Are there duplication of notifications? Is there a better prioritization? Maybe look to some of the newer technologies and how things like AI can help to prioritize, or be aware of how much noise is too much noise and dial some of that back based on when it's appropriate. Understanding, people might have a bit more time at the beginning of their day on their commute, for example, but understanding when are key time blocks and restrict some of that noise at times where people want to be focusing. So lots of different angles there. There's the governance angle, the kind of like top-down governance to help people make sure it doesn't become too noisy, let people take control of their experiences with personalization, and also look to some of the like system intelligent, cooler AI type stuff that might be able to help as well. Cool. So moving on to our next question. Sorry, I'm going to come back to you, Mark. I see IT foundations, and I thought this is a Mark one. So what are the top 3 IT foundation issues that are roadblocks to implementing a platform like Unily?
Great question. I'm going to take 3 and make it 1. The biggest challenge we often find is making sure that we're having a strong conversation around security. And what do I mean by security in this instance from an IT foundation? It's making sure we have the right levels of security for the right users. Amy said something earlier when we were introducing things like one-to-one chat. If you put too many things in the way of your users, they will find the easiest place to go. And that can create ungoverned IT networks. So people taking to WhatsApp or text message or other forms of communication. So that conversation on security is really important. So it's things like, when we're creating policies for BYOD, so bring your own device, so I can access that content where and when I need it. What are we happy to do as an organization? When I think about things such as AI and those components, again, what are we happy to do as an organization? So the conversation around security and the scaled security is probably the biggest blocker. Everything else, it should be a conversation, but that is probably the biggest blocker, and the conversation that I'd always encourage us to have early in the journey, because otherwise that can derail you later on.
Nice. So let's move on to the next question then, which says, I'd be really interested in views on the role of enterprise social in accelerating the digital workplace. In an organization with very low maturity, what puzzle pieces move first? So I have a bit of a personal opinion here, which feel free anyone to jump in on, but my view is that one of the benefits of enterprise social is that it can be very quick. It gives you a quick leg up into utilizing quite broad use cases and capabilities, whether it's employee resource groups, whether it's quick ideas, whether it's quickly communicating out initiatives. It's something that can be mobilized quite quickly. And my other view is that if one of the reasons you have, I mean, there are multiple reasons you might have like low maturity when it comes to technical stuff, but typically one of the issues is adoption, which has come up quite a lot. And I feel like, from my millennial perspective, I feel like enterprise social tools are something that people get very quickly and easily because it feels much more like second nature. There are lots of enterprise technologies out there, like your ERPs and things like that, that take much more change management training for people to understand, how does this work? How does this work with something else? And so adoption is a long, steady process to get people on. But I'm personally a massive fan of getting enterprise social out there, of course, with some governance and some rules to make sure that it doesn't become unwieldy. But I'd say it's a good entry technology to start your digital workplace journey. And any other views on that?
No, the only other thing that I would add is sometimes some people come to us and they don't know what the extra value is, and that's our job. Like, that's what we do. And so I know, Mark, you do this so well, but finding that sounded really sarcastic. I actually really meant that. You might think that it's just about collaboration and having a tool for your team to use, but we spoke a lot about innovation, productivity, fast pivots. There are real things that we can unlock with a digital experience platform that you might not even realize. And so finding a partner who can understand the business goals, you might start with social, but it doesn't have to end there, I think, is our point. And it's really up to us and yourselves to understand what that trajectory is and how we can unlock that in a way that feels manageable and feels scalable. But yeah, Mark, you're nodding. Is that feel right?
Yeah, no, completely agree. And I know my quick summary exactly what you said there. Start with what they understand. So start with the social components. Social becomes communities, community becomes, and then you start to grow it up. But you brought them into something they understand, something where you can build trust, and from trust you can start to expand it. So I completely agree with you there, Amy.
Nice. I also think that whatever your journey looks like, whatever technologies you bring in, enterprise social does help you gather that feedback from employees and see it, iterate, and gather feedback. So we're quite aligned there. Cool. So we've got two more questions, I believe. So the first one, the penultimate one is, what have been the most successful integrations you have made that have driven engagement for social and community? Are there any aspects of social and community that have been tied into work-related areas? Julian, let's start with you. Give a bit of a Wipro perspective and see if anyone else can add.
Sure. So I think one of the key aspects is that enterprise social is not all about fun. There's a bit of a bias against enterprise social in some circumstances, because our colleagues do find a lot of value in social communities, especially when they focus on a business function or specific technical aspects. So let me give you a few examples of some of those communities. We've got country-specific communities, which at the level of India, where Wipro is headquartered, becomes a city-specific community because our campuses locally are so massive. And colleagues typically will discuss local topics, things like benefits, even carpooling, campus events. We recently launched another community for people managers, which includes communications from HR colleagues who are supporting managers, but also managers, sometimes first-time people managers who can get access to toolkits, but also peer support. And that's really that flattening of the access and the instantaneity as well of getting responses from any other colleague in other locations. That's also providing value, right? And during appraisal season, discussing the process for appraisals, because these tend to be quite complex, and especially for people who go through them for the first time. I was talking about technology communities a little bit earlier. So that's where experts and practitioners can exchange. So current topics at the moment where we have communities include AI, cloud, but also more technical communities for specific deployment or types of technologies. And then we talked about employee resource groups with the focus on the Pride example, but that's also something that's been replicated for women, ERGs, disability, and others, and that's really helping amplify the activities that are happening. So again, from something that might be happening locally, you can get global exposure internally within the company, and that's really really powerful. But also beyond the very tactical aspects of the communities, right? That community thinking is also something you need to develop within your day-to-day practices, right? So during team meetings or all hands, there's interesting overlaps as well and connect points that you can build in. You were talking about QR codes earlier and profiles of colleagues. That's also something that's very powerful and that helps highlight different ways of working and bringing people together and having that engagement, which builds a great culture in the company.
Nice, good answer. And I also think that, like, to speak from like a personal perspective as well, like one of the ways I think we use it best internally at Unily is we've mentioned innovation a lot throughout this webinar, and I kind of feel like one of the people in the organization in different units and different geographical areas always have like the best ideas, especially the closer you get to the customer, the better ideas they have. And I think understanding, we've discussed some of those use cases, we saw Holland and Barrett with those ideas. What are the different use cases that you can really flex to that might get people involved and get people excited about using enterprise social? And especially if you think from a leader's perspective, people are operating in competitive industries. If you want to operate at high velocity and ensure that you're outcompeting people in your industry or staying ahead of the curve, it's really about mobilizing those ideas and making them happen as quick as possible. And that's where I think enterprise social can really add value. So yeah. And coming on to our final question, which is, I knew we'd get a question on this. Have you used any analytics to gain insights into the social and community area? What insights have you gained that have led to creating greater engagement, and how was this done? I'm sure we can always do on this. Julian, actually, from the Pride ERG, do you look at any analytics there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely applicable to the Pride community, but also all of the other communities, because as part of the governance model, we have reviews, if not quarterly, at least twice a year. And the engagement analytics, that's something that we look at during those reviews. What we noticed, interestingly, as we're trying to reduce the amount of emails, we do also notice the impact of emails, which also drive a lot of traffic, and we've identified peaks. Specifically after emails are sent, peaks to those particular posts or pages that we reference in the emails. So that's also a way to generate engagement that more traditional channel via email. But in terms of analytics, we're talking about top contributors, so we look at that as well, top posts, and that's helping us as well identify campaigns or types of engagements that are successful, and again, spread the best practice. All those examples as part of the monthly community engagements that we have with the community managers, so the wider community can benefit from these best practices. And I think this is pretty much it for now.
Excellent. I think there's always the value of analytics as well is understanding like what are the high engagement communities. And I think we've had a lot of questions around adoption and engagement, and I feel like if you're able to prove analytics, whether that's from a community perspective to help other communities to thrive, that's super helpful. But also from a leadership perspective, if you can show leaders who were engaged in social, how that helped them get more engagement and adoption around their communications and their content and their perception, then showing that to leaders. Data is really powerful in communicating a story to help more engagement. It like feeds the funnel. So that's what I think is really helpful. Unless anyone else has anything else, no. Cool, excellent. That's bringing us nicely to time as well. So thank you all for really great questions, and thank you so much to my panelists, Mark, Amy, Julian. You've been outstanding.